On Grady Hill by Brent Noury. Read by Brent Noury. Chapter 9. Clark Farm and the Moonshine Recluse. Now, children, as we were, I was standing in the middle of Haven Street. Titus was next to me. Samuel was atop Josephine. Samuel told Titus that it required his help over at Hospitality Manor. Samuel was going to speak with Mr. Anglo about some business. As Titus rounded up his horse and ready to head off with Samuel, Samuel turned to me and said, "Miss Astrid, would you mind meeting me over at Mrs. Antono's place about 1 p.m.? I'm headed off to Gentry's this morning, and I could use your help over at Clark Farm when I return around 1. Titus and I shot confused looks at each other, and I mumbled something in response like, "I suppose so, Samuel, but Mrs. Antono is bound to be a wreck with sadness, so don't leave me alone too long with just her and poor Jem Antono's letters." I was so embarrassed to say such a thing about Mrs. Madeline Antono, but she really had gone mad drunk over recent time. Samuel said, "We're just meeting there and then going to see Moonshine Clark." Now this time, Titus shot Samuel a concerned look. "Don't worry, Titus. You're coming along too. I don't want you to miss the party," Samuel said with that same sort of sick grin. Titus and Samuel headed off to Hospitality Manor, and I stopped into Arthur Faraday's bookstore. Arthur used to bring his sister's pastries down every morning from Faraday's farm. He had also learned his pressed coffee method from his sister, Tabitha Faraday. Now, Faraday's pastries is a whole nother story, children, but I can say, to shorten it up, Miss Tabitha was my best friend in town, but in those days she never came off Faraday Farm due to her extreme shyness and nervous nature. But eventually she'd break out of that and come to town and start Faraday's Pastry and Diner, where Arthur's old bookshop was. Arthur would build the town library by the railroad station when that part of center of Haven Street was built. Anyways, Arthur's bookstore had the same front window as Faraday's Pastry does now, and I would sit there in that nook with my special coffee and book. I watched Samuel, Titus, and Mr. Anglo come out of Hospitality Manor. The three of them headed up the road around the mountain towards Gentry. I spent the rest of that morning until just past noon sitting in Arthur's window, and as hard as I try, I can't remember what I was reading. My mind was on how Samuel looked and how he'd rounded up the boys, seemingly for war, and I had some part to play over at Clark's. Samuel was one of Recluse Andy's only good friends, and vice versa. Jem Antono had been good friends to the Clarks as well. In the old days, before the Great Fire, the Clarks had the biggest corn farm for miles. They had by far the best yellow, in-season corn you've ever had. Mr. Andrew Clark Sr. had perished in the fire along with Big Bill. That left just young Mr. Andy Clark to run the whole farm. But with Jem Antono needing to split time between Clark's cornfields and up topside here with the Gradys, eventually young Andy started shortening the farm each season until it was just his rye field for making shine. And Andy became all consumed with his shine, his method. Samuel and Titus had stayed good friends with Andy, partaking in his shine on occasion, even as the whole farm and land and barns became overgrown. Clark's farm was like a lost land, and Mrs. Anthony's place was right at the entrance to the farm. I was hurrying there now, not to be late for Samuel. End of chapter 9.